Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to another day of story time. Tuesdays, the day where you get to sit back and just let me tell you stories. Or more specifically, I get to read you books. In this case, Far Country by Peter Rice. We'll be starting into, I want to say, chapter 16 tonight. Let's see, am I right? Am I right? Chapter 17. We did 1 through 8, and then 9 through 16. We're starting in chapter 17. Oh, yay! Happy days are here again. We read the books to you again. And, of course, my previous chapters are all up on my YouTube page, youtube.com/@SirArmenius. Go over there, take a listen, and get caught up on where we're at. I mean, because if you're joining here and you've never heard any of this before, you don't know what's going on, go back, listen to the chapters. I'll be posting these ones up on my YouTube later tonight. So once that's done, then you can get caught up there. Or you can just stay here and chill out and enjoy along with the rest of us anyway. So sit back, everyone, relax, and prepare to enjoy as we jump in to Far Country. So let's do a very brief recap of a little bit of what happened, so far. So they met the alien birds. One of the alien birds got shot. One of them got killed. Tastes like chicken. They brought back an ally to the camp. Talked to the ally, helped to heal him. He, since left and went on his way. The Tatate have decided that they are going to basically shun and move away from these humans because the humans shot one of their number. At the same time, they, our human population found out that there was other humans that have landed on this planet before them. And because people have landed on the planet before them, there are other humans on the planet. There are 3 basic enclaves that they have heard about of those people. And with those 3 enclaves of people, basically what they're going to do is go and try to say hello to them. They took out the Phoenix Hawk, which is the flying mech, the Lamb, and the intention was to go and do a flyover and just get a little reconnaissance. But of course, some mercenaries didn't want to do that. They wanted to make contact. So they made contact. And by making contact, they essentially started kind of their negotiations with all of those people. And that is where we land as we come into here. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll just get ourselves going right into chapter 17. 17. Both Takuda and Vost were wrong in their estimations of the time needed for their respective tasks. The section contact patrol, headed by Gunso Arsenault, was back in 6 days rather than the 7 that had been allotted. That event had opposite effects on Takuda and Vost. One was happy, the other decidedly was not. Vost's unhappy reaction had more to do with the difficulties in breaking out the other mechs from the dropship than the desk patrol returning too soon, however. When they'd pried the Lamb out, it had been with the single thought of freeing it from the strained hull of the dropship. They'd paid little heed to the relative position of the rest of the mechs in relation to the breach. Most of the cutting of the hull had been at the top along the main dorsal spar. The dross produced by the cutting and the subsequent wrenching of the hull had made an opening for the Lamb, but it had pinned the other mechs behind the slag. In the excitement of the original extraction, no one had thought to plan for the future. The second problem had to do with the Lamb's actual exit. Because they hadn't been able to cut an opening big enough for the Lamb, which had been transported in the air configuration, to walk out of the dropship, Seagroves had been forced to take it out as an air vehicle. The exhaust gases from the Allied Battletech 125 jet propulsion system had vented straight into the hull of the dropship, where they had played havoc with the interior. It would have been better if they had cut gas escape ports into the opposite side of the hull, but there had been no time for that. The other mech pilots had managed, in varying degrees, to protect their machines from the gases, but other equipment had suffered considerable damage. The blast of the exhaust had been deflected downward onto the cargo deck by the opposite side of the hull, the force and heat annihilating the portside cargo access doors. They wouldn't be doing any cutting on that side of the dropship. The blast had continued into the base of the cargo bay, warping and melting part of the decking. Some of the gases had escaped into the lower holding compartments. The rest had penetrated into the open space of the main bay. The velocity and force of the jet propulsion exhaust had scattered anything not secured, as well as some things that were, against the starboard skin and braces. Thus, it was not a matter of simply freeing up the mechs and letting them climb out the opening cut for the Lamb. Before they could release the mechs, the work parties had to repair the damage done by the blast and cut free the refuse that was stuck to various portions of the interior. Vost's Panther was the mech most buried. It had suffered some damage from the fiery exhaust, and all the systems would have to be checked and repaired before it could be activated. Vost insisted, however, that his mech receive first priority for extraction. For 3 days, Vost spent all his time in the Panther's command seat. The hot gases had scoured the cockpit glass, and Michel Guardin had spent the whole time spread-eagled across the bubble, using a grinding wheel to smooth the crazing and polish the surface. The ogive of the glass was made of high-low surface tension material that was both extremely tough and extremely fragile. The high surface tension of the wind screen made it virtually impervious to all but a direct hit, while the low surface tension of the interior of the glass would act as a shock absorber. The brittle outer surface would break up the incoming round, but the softer inside would flex ever so slightly to distribute the force of the hit over the entire surface. If the outer skin, a mere 2 millimeters thick, were scratched, the inner surface would lose its structural integrity and collapse. Guardin had to be very careful to use only the finest grit to polish away the marks on the outside. The work of clearing would have gone faster, except that the other mech pilots spent the time on their vehicles. In a mercenary unit like Vost's, each warrior was the actual owner of the mech he piloted, even though the group was under the nominal military command of the leader. It was very difficult, except in a tactical situation, for Vost to get all his people to work toward a common goal. He tried to persuade and then order the other pilots and their techs to help out with the Panther, but his efforts came to naught. Holly Goodall was the first to tell him where to get off, and the other pilots quickly followed suit. Only Pesht, the javelin pilot, was willing to help, and even that was done more with an eye to getting his javelin free. By the 6th day, the Panther was almost out, and Vost estimated that it would only be a few more hours more before the javelin was also up and operational. As the work neared completion, a plan began to solidify in his mind. Until now, he'd been unable to do anything about getting rid of the Dest team because his mechs had been inaccessible. Now his first move was to mention to Seagroves that one blast from the Lamb's heavy lasers could blow the Dest command bunker, by now a significant structure, into oblivion. Seagroves had demurred on the grounds that attacking the headquarters would not do any good. The heavy weapons section, commanded by Ariake Sane, would react and dismember his mech with a few well-aimed shots. Vosted nodded and smiled. Things would be different, he said, when all the mechs were out. The conversation rested there, but the seed had been planted. Late on the afternoon of the 6th day, Arsenault and his section patrol returned to camp, their appearance a surprise to all but Takuda, who had maintained contact with them through the secure voice communicator in his headset. Before the patrol had set out, he and Arsenault had coordinated on time and frequency for transmissions. Most were carried out by laser line-of-sight light wave carrier. Radio, an archaic system, was only used as backup. Takuda and Arsenault had decided on the older system because the mercenary unit's comlinks were laser primary. They would probably never think to use the radio backup, and even if they did, the possibility of them finding the correct frequency was slight. In addition, all voice transmissions were scrambled so that even if someone located the transmission, he or she would have no idea what was being said. The line had remained secure. Arsenault went immediately to report to Takuda, but he'd barely begun before members of the mercenary unit began to filter into the headquarters bunker. Takuda could have stopped the ingress, but decided against it. He knew that the information would get out soon enough, and he wanted to maintain an open relationship with the mercenaries. He let them in as Arsenault continued to talk. The first part of Arsenault's report consisted of an overview of the patrol, the routes taken, and the terrain traversed. All of this was interesting to Takuda, who would have to plan any movement to the west, but it was deadly dull to the mercenaries. All they would need do was hop into their mechs and travel like the wind. The mercenary technicians, on the other hand, took some interest because they would have to walk out. Then came the part that Vost especially wanted to hear, the report on the enclaves and the possibility of making a deal with one of them. The report was short, sweet, and to the point. Arsenault said he'd obtained the information by observation from a distance and via limited contact with humans who had ventured away from the immediate vicinity of the walled towns. Arsenault had done most of the talking, acquiring some, but not very detailed information. There were 3 enclaves, he said. The one to the north was called Osio, and seemed to be under complete centralized control of a dictator. This was much like the old von Rohr's dynasty taken to the extreme. They were a recognizable group, but they had all of the human attitudes of that long-dead dynasty. They hadn't had the experience, or did not assimilate the experience, of the McAllister years. They hadn't learned anything. The second was Amatukaze, a religious enclave that had fallen back on the pure Shinto Buddhist philosophy. They were fundamentalists who regarded the other enclaves as heretical in the extreme. Where Osio wanted to dominate, the Amatukaze would like to exterminate. This was religion taken to the extreme. The third was Usugumo, an enclave controlled by a merchant oligarchy that had subverted everything to the god of profit. They had the most money, but were dominated by a group of families who exploited everything they touched. Arsenault's listeners received the information with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Vost was ecstatic. Takuda was depressed. Vost now had a base from which to deal. The militarists of Osio would be more than willing to buy a weapon system that would make their dictatorship supreme. The fact that they were the von Rohrs personified made little difference to him. The only fly in that ointment might be their possible desire to swallow up the mercenaries into their rigid hierarchy. Definitely not an appealing prospect. The Amatukaze's hatred of the other 2 enclaves would make them more than willing to see the others crushed, and they would probably pay well to see it done. But Vost had dealt with religious fanatics before, and knew that once the mission was accomplished, they would expect him to continue to embrace their cause. That was fine with Vost, as long as the cause aligned with his interests, which, in this case, did not sound very likely. The Usagumo group was a real possibility. They sounded amoral, willing to pay in cash for what they wanted, and Vost could use offers from the others as a baseline for his dealings with them. The negotiations would be sweet. He rubbed his hands with prospective delight. Takuda did not see it that way. He'd been thinking about the matter ever since hearing about the other humans from Dakota. Here had been the perfect opportunity for a group of warriors to build the perfect Bushido-based society far from the hurly-burly of the inner sphere. They could have established the traditional samurai society of warriors and workers, taking all the traditions to their natural conclusion. But that was not what they had done. No, they had fractured their small society into hostile groups. He and the others would have to act as spiritual guides for the original humans, showing them back to the true way, the path of harmony. He looked up at the circle of faces that surrounded him in the headquarters bunker. "We must move slowly," he said. "There is much that we can do here, but we must lead these people away from their hostility to the true path of harmony. We must become the moral exemplars they seem to have lacked, but we must go slowly. We must build a society that the Draconis Combine, should they ever find us, would be proud to call its own." His statement was greeted by stunned silence. "Like hell we will," said Vost, who promptly turned on his heel and stomped out of the bunker. These chapters are so much shorter than I'm used to reading on these ones, so, hey, more breaks for me. I'm kind of okay with that. "18. Dawn came gray, as much because of the low-hanging clouds and misting rain as because of the mood in the camp. Even the campfires seemed unable to blaze brightly. Sodden, sullen, gray. The weather matched Takuda's humor exactly. He sat in the earthen command bunker, pushed back into the corner farthest from the low opening, the darkest corner, to match his mood. The events of the evening had come as a surprise. Not just Vost's reaction, which he should have expected. Even the reaction of the others should have been predictable. The one who had surprised Takuda most was himself. He had no idea what had made him suddenly proclaim the idea of serving as moral exemplars to the planet's inhabitants. The words coming out of his mouth had been a shock, even to him. Never in his life had he thought of himself in that way. It was against his heredity and his training. He sat and thought about what had happened. His musings were interrupted by So-Cho Saitan Yura, who stood before him, waiting for the desk commander to acknowledge his presence. But Takuda felt no pressing need to do so. He would acknowledge the senior sergeant when he was ready. If the sergeant's mission had been really urgent, the man would have announced himself. Takuda looked up and scrutinized the professional soldier. Saitan Yura had spent his whole adult life in the forces of the Draconis Combine. There was no way of telling how old he was. His face was as smooth as any young man's. Yet Takuda knew that some of the So-Cho's decorations dated from campaigns of 40 years earlier. He had been in the service as long as Takuda had been alive. "Yes, So-Cho. You wish to see me?" "Pilot Vost has requested to speak to you." "A request? Pilot Vost has never been so formal with me before. This must be important. Did he say anything to indicate what it might be? No, Sosha, said Yura. The lights burning late in the hull of the dropship last night, but there were no sounds of walking. It was typical of the senior sergeant, thought Takuda, to offer information without comment. The mercenaries must have been talking, but the sergeant could not note that directly, and so he would not venture a supposition. He gave only what he knew. Is he waiting for me now? Takuda asked. Yes, Shosa. He and the others of his mercenaries are outside. Takuda nodded. Rising to his feet, he felt the stiffness in his joints. It was hell getting old. Men of his culture were supposed to be able to sit in the lotus position for hours without discomfort, a feat Takuda had never been able to master. Even as a young man, he'd found sitting in chairs much preferable to sitting cross-legged on the floor. He waited a moment for his joints to stop protesting. He was not going to let Vost see him hobbling. The mercenary commander was waiting for Takuda, who could see that the meeting, called formally by Vost, was going to be confrontational. The mercenary leader had brought along all his people to add weight to whatever argument he was about to make. The Shosa glanced around to see which of his own people were in the area. It would be an admission of weakness for him to call the whole team together, but he wouldn't mind having some support if needed. Yura was still at his side, standing 1 pace to the rear and 2 to his left, where he would remain until released. The So-Cho had sensed the strain in the air, and would support his commander. Clustered on top of the bunker were the 3 members of the team's heavy weapons section. Gunso Ariaki Sene was demonstrating the correct method of field stripping a Pleno Hamada short-range missile launcher. The weapon had some distinctive characteristics that required special attention, but Takuda was sure that everyone in the heavy weapons section, as well as every other member of the DES team, was completely familiar with those idiosyncrasies. Sine had probably decided to hold the class on top of the command bunker for reasons that went well beyond training. Gunso Ariaki Sane was a mystery to her commander. Of all the people on his team, she was the one about whom Takuda knew the least. That she was competent was not in doubt. No one could become a member of the DEST Special Forces who was not, but she remained an enigma. Tall, willowy, and with a face cut from alabaster, she seemed to exist in a world of her own. As far as Takuda knew, she had no close friends among the rest of the team, not even Andy Holland, who made friends with everyone. Sine ran the heavy weapons section firmly, fairly, and with high professional standards. She observed all the religious rituals with punctilious accuracy, and that was all Takuda knew. The other 2 members of the section had taken on some of her characteristics. Because heavy weapons people seldom functioned as a team, they tended to be loners. Certainly Gunso Ariaki Sane was. Gocho Oiti Inaduma, the team's anti-tank expert, also fit the mold. Even though he'd been decorated for bravery more than any member of the team, they had been more acts of individual heroism than sacrifice for another. Thus, Inaduma was a 3-time recipient of the Bushido Blade, and had even been recommended for the Order of the Dragon, but had never been mentioned for the White Starburst. The Starburst was bestowed on those who saved the lives of other soldiers or civilians through their heroism. Inaduma was more likely to go it alone in combat, stalking armored fighting vehicles or mechs for the sheer pleasure of it. Some would call that foolhardy rather than brave. Johto High Johan Miranda was the team sniper, and he had the sniper mentality. Once he had remained in an open field for 12 hours without moving in order to get a kill. Absolutely stationary even to the point of not emptying his bladder. Not only was the man a model of self-discipline, he was also the best marksman Takuda had ever seen. The stalking kill was his specialty, but he could fire on the move as well. Takuda had once seen Miranda shooting rats from the hip, hitting them through the eyes as the little beasts scampered from their nests. He'd done that, the man later explained, because hitting their bodies would have ruined the meat. With his weapons people on the command bunker and Yura behind him, Takuda faced Garber Vost.
"I've been thinking about what you said yesterday,"
Vost began in his most polite and servile manner.
"And you just may be right."
Takuda, braced for a fierce attack, was astonished by this abrupt change from the mercenary's usual sneering bravado. He recovered quickly, determined to remain on guard. He waited for the other shoe to drop.
"There's no reason why we should not be teachers to these people," continued Vost. "Not only do we have weapons that make us superior, but we also have the benefit of 500 years of society's traditions, which these people obviously lack.
That they have fragmented into warring enclaves is foolish. They would have been much better off working together in peace and harmony." Takuda nodded but did not speak, sensing that Vost was planning to take this line of thought in another direction entirely. Another motive was lurking in there somewhere.
"Harmony is very important,"
said Vost, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, rather than in the usual hands-on-hips pose.
"It is what we should all strive to achieve in our interpersonal relationships, as well as in the greater relationships between cities and states. It is the most noble of all life's goals."
"I agree with you, Pilot Vost. Harmony is important, even though life also demands us duty, honor, and loyalty. But yes, harmony is a very high ideal."
"If we are to teach harmony to the people of Osio, Amata, Tukaze, and Usagumo, would it not be appropriate for harmony to exist among those who would lead the way?"
Vost was smiling a soft, winsome smile, the very essence of what he spoke.
A most noble thought, Pilot Vost."
"You should call me Garber," Shosa Takuda.
"Thank you, Pilot Vost."
Takuda had no wish to encourage familiarity. Vost was quite familiar enough already.
"I'm glad you have decided to support the wishes of the whole team in our dealings with the other humans, and the aliens as well."
Takuda threw in the mention of the Tatate to make sure Vost understood that more was at stake than just the enclaves. He saw Vost flinch at the mention of the Tatate. Good, Takuda thought. Perhaps he will be a little off balance. Vost hardly missed a beat.
"And you agree that to achieve harmony we must do the greatest good for the greatest number, yes?"
Vost nodded as he spoke. It was an old rhetorical trick, and whether Vost was aware of doing it or not, he accomplished it to perfection. The first part of the trick came in telling the listener what he wanted to hear. This was accented by nodding the head in agreement with one's own statements.
"Good for the greatest number is important."
Takuda knew the rhetorical tricks, even if Vost did not. He cut to the point.
"Where is this going?"
"If we are to do the greatest good for the greatest number, perhaps we should ask the number what they want. I suggest that the program you proposed yesterday be put forward along with any other proposals. Then we let the people who will be affected have their say in the matter."
"I agree," said Collis Brank, stepping forward. "I say we listen to all of it and then vote on what to do."
"And are there other matters on which we should take a vote, Pilot Vost?"
Takuda's eyes narrowed. He could see the point of the meeting coming closer. Well, now that you mention it, yes. Perhaps we should decide, by vote of course, who is to be the leader of this group.
Do you have someone in mind?
I'd like to put forward the name of Reston Bannon. And I'd like to put forward the name of Garber Vost, interjected Brink. And, of course, your name as well, Shosa Takuda, said Vost with a smile.
And then all of us would stand for election, said Takuda. Is that your plan? And then the new leader would tell us what to do about the humans and the aliens. Is that it?
I think you've got it, said Vost. He put his hands on his hips. It was a clever plan, thought Takuda. There were 11 members of the desk team and only 10 mercenaries. That would seem to assure Takuda's victory in any election. But the mercenaries had signed on with Vost because they believed their interests lay with him, so there was no reason to think they wouldn't do so again. That would leave the decision in the hands of the ship crews. With Bannon's name in the pot, they might be assumed to go that way, but Takuda could not be sure. The crew members would be willing to vote, but hardly likely to want to throw their votes away on a sure loser. Vost would need only a couple of their votes to become the group's acknowledged leader. The mercenary had obviously been doing some politicking during the night and knew what kind of support he could muster. You say we take a vote right now? Said Collis Brink. Let's get it over with so we can get on with other things. Neatly done, thought Takuda. There would be no time for him to talk to the ship crews, even if he were so inclined. They'd used the argument about harmony to trap him. Very neat. He couldn't think of any way to get out of the situation without establishing himself as a dictator. Though he didn't want to do that, he was equally unwilling to see Vost take absolute power in the group. Yura would say nothing to interfere with what was happening. Takuda was trapped, and he knew it.
I call good ideas,
came the voice of Johann Miranda from the top of the command bunker.
Your thoughts have much merit, Pilot Vost.
Takuda turned to face the weapons team on the roof behind him. Was Miranda going to desert him? He wondered.
I would suggest,
continued the team sniper,
that we all do some thinking about it. There is no need to make a decision immediately. Wouldn't you agree?
Miranda was sitting cross-legged in the dirt, a position that was not ostensibly very intimidating, yet a very stable one from which to shoot. The sniper cradled his Zeus heavy rifle in his lap, his meaning quite clear. Vost looked startled by the comment. His hands dropped from his hips and he took a step backward into Brink, who had been sheltering behind him.
That's fine for now, he said with a soft snarl, but it will happen sooner or later. Count on it.
And chapter 18 done. And now on to chapter 19. Vost was angry, as angry as he had ever been in his life. He stomped his way back to the dropship. Not even the soft cooing of Michel Guardine, his current Inamatora, could reflect his anger. He swept her aside with a wave of an arm, and she crept away bruised and chagrined. Meanwhile, Vost ground his teeth and plotted. The other mercenary stood around at a respectful distance and waited for the inevitable explosion.
We'll just have to blow that bastard away, announced Vost. We get the mechs out of the blasted ship and just blow him and the rest of his team away.
Elizabeth Hoond, First mate of the abandoned jump ship, Teledyne, inched forward from the circle. I've been looking at the interior of the dropship. Based on what we've done and what needs to be done, we could have the mechs out in about 2 days.
We could blast our way out, interjected Kendall Pesht.
The mood among the mercenaries was changing. They were beginning to see possibilities rather than problems. They'd hear us, said Hund. They have a guard posted all night, supposedly to protect us from the aliens. The guard would be sure to alert the others. Mechs don't blast anything without making some noise.
So they'd hear us, said Vost. So what? If we move quickly, we can have some or all of the mechs out of the hold before the Dest crud can react. The mechs have IR sensors. We can see in the dark.
So can they, put in Calder Sprank. Infantry weapons in the hands of normal troops are hopeless against mechs. But we're up against a Dest team. They're specially trained for anti-mech work. They love it. And they have special weapons for the job. Have you ever seen what well-handled infantry weapons can do to a mech at close range? Frank shuddered. That SRM launcher they were working on today can fire infernos. And they've got 'em. I've seen 'em. The last thing I want is to be in any mech that gets hit by an inferno. The other pilots nodded agreement. Fire was one of a mech warrior's greatest terrors. The thought of being trapped inside a mech cockpit while the machine burned to death was every mech pilot's nightmare. There were too many stories of pilots incinerated. Too many stories that began, "I had a friend who," then ended with how that someone had been unable to fight free of the flames and unable to eject because a fire had disabled the machine's ejection mechanism.
"Then we take out the SRMs," said Vost. "We got to get the weapons people first. And Dakuda. Decapitate the team. Get him and the rest won't know what to do. By then we'll be out and running things. Blow them all away."
Vost folded his arms in contemplation of the thought.
"Just think of it," he mused. "We take out the Dest team, and then we have it all. We can cut any deal we want with any of the enclaves. We go with the highest bidder. Not the strongest, but the one who gives us the most. We can run this place for as long as we want. We'll be so powerful nothing can stop us. Tell 'em, Seagroves. Tell 'em about the enclaves, from a mech warrior's point of view. What do we need to know about them?"
All heads turned toward Brian Seagroves. Of the mercenaries, he was the only one who had seen the enclaves, the only one who could speak with authority. The big man shuffled forward. At last he would be the center of attention, as he deserved.
"They're weak," he said. "They have complex defensive works, but none of it means anything. Lots of walls and ditches. They don't even have a bodice. The only thing their defenses are designed to stop are really weak ground forces. They don't have anything that can stop a mech. We'd walk right through them, and they don't have anything that flies. Nothing. There's something in their culture, their legends, that says they mustn't fly. Maybe someone has tried it, but they don't permit it anymore. With the lamb and the panther's jump ability, we can scare the hell out of anyone. We win every time. As long as none of the Dest gets involved. So we take care of Dest."
Seagroves was angry at being interrupted. This was his show, and he didn't need Vost interfering. Seagroves had already decided which enclave he was going to join. That of the Usagumo. They were the ones with the money. The gold. He didn't care about fighting for a bunch of militaristic types. He'd had enough of Dakuda and the way his people followed orders. Hard to corrupt those stiff-necked types. The religious fanatics of Amatukaze were just as bad, rigid in another way. No, he'd go with Usagumo no matter what the others decided, and he didn't have to listen to Vost pontificate about making choices.
We go with the best offer. I'm done with people who don't understand the value of money.
He turned on Vost and glared at him.
From what I saw, the merchants are in the most need. We go with them and be done with it.
Vost was surprised by this speech. Seagroves, usually so docile, was suddenly showing traits that could lead to problems down the road. He'd have to be more careful in dealing with the Lamb pilot in the future. But he knew which buttons to push for Seagroves. Money was all the man cared for, a fact Vost would use to his own advantage. He waited now to see if Seagroves was done. When the Lamb pilot said no more, the mercenary leader spoke again.
Pest, Goodall, Brank, check your mechs. See what needs to be done to get them free. Not completely free, just enough so that they can blast their way out of the cargo hold. Take your techs with you. Guardine, check my mech. Make sure the jump packs are clear to fire. I can take the Panther out through the top of the opening. Seagroves, I've got a special job for you.
He turned to the Lamb pilot.
You're the only one who's free right now,
Vost said conspiratorially, taking Seagroves by the elbow in a show of brotherhood and good faith.
When all this goes down, you'll have to play the lead. We can't do anything without you.
Vost saw Seagroves visibly swell at the compliment. This guy is so transparent, he thought. I can play him like a cheap harp.
When I give the word, you hit their command bunker with the lasers and the machine guns. Just blow it away.
Without warning? It was Goodall. She looked upset at the prospect.
Hell yes, snapped Vost. It's them or us. This is no time to worry about niceties. We'll give them what they deserve. Do you think that slant-eyed Takuda would give us a chance if he thought he could get away with it? I don't trust him a bit.
As a matter of fact, said Goodall, stepping forward, I do think he'd give us a chance. He's had plenty of time to take a whack at us, and he certainly had call to do so. But he hasn't. I think he's an honorable man. I, for one, trust him. She didn't add the words, more than I trust you, but the implication was there.
You can believe any way you like, Holly,
said Vost, not hiding the menace in his voice.
Just as long as you do as you're told and stay out of our way. If you get squeamish, close your eyes till it's over.
The teams broke up and began their tasks. Seagroves climbed onto the back of his Phoenix Hawk and began his first-level maintenance checks. Underos Yapudi, his technician, stood on the ground and called off the checklist as Seagroves made the inspection. It was mostly sham. Seagroves was actually reconnecting the laser controls, broken before he had flown his first mission. He'd done that on Takuda's command, and the weapon system had not been reactivated since. There'd been no need. Now, however, the lasers had a mission. One, chuckled Seagroves to himself, that Takuda would find most interesting. Yapudi called off the list and Seagroves responded. The pilot cleared the ammunition belts for the heavy machine guns. He was ready. All he needed to do was make a slight torso twist and align the IR sight on the command bunker. That would be easy. Inside the disintegrating hull of the dropship, the other mech pilots were also going about their work. Guardine checked the jump packs on the back of the Panther, making sure they were fully charged and that the back blast area was as clear as possible. When Vost fired the mech out the top of the cargo bay, no one wanted any FOD. Foreign object damage was a part of being a mech pilot, but none of them was fool enough to ask for such an accident. A steel box driven into a knee servo could freeze a mech in place at just the wrong time. Best to keep the area as clear as possible. Holly Goodall and Sagiri Johnson worked on her Locust. With the debris around the light mech cleared away, all that was left now was to release the holding shackles. Johnson and Goodall worked in silence, each one deep in his or her own thoughts. Working beside them on the other Locust, Brank and Panda were equally absorbed in freeing that mech. Goodall and Johnson moved to the opposite side of the Locust.
"What do you think of the plan?"
Johnson said, almost adding sir to the question. Old habit died hard. It's a plan, said Goodall with a shrug.
"I'm not crazy about the complete execution."
Johnson's statement was absolutely non-committal. Anyone hearing it and not seeing the look in his eyes would have thought nothing of it. You mean murder?
"That's not what I said."
I know that's not what you said. Goodall's voice was low enough not to carry beyond them. I just wonder what you meant. Sagiri Johnson worked silently on the restraining shackle, applying himself diligently to the task of removing some microscopic speck of dirt in the release mechanism. It took quite a while. Goodall waited for him to finish.
"I wasn't too pleased with that slant-eyed comment,"
the technician said finally. That's typical Vost, Goodall said dryly. He thinks he's superior because he's a mech warrior, and because of his race, and because he's a man. Typical. Sorry, Sagiri. Present company accepted. The technician smiled at this woman who could pilot a Locust with the best of the best.
"Don't worry, I know what you mean. And I agree with what you said about Takuda. I like the guy, even if he's a little rigid. And I'm not saying that because I'm a man or because my mother was Oriental. I just like him."
Well, he'll be dead by dawn if Vost has his way.
"I'm not really happy about that either."
Johnson gazed off into the depths of the cargo hold.
"He doesn't need to die, and certainly not that way."
The technician stared at nothing.
"I'm not even sure it wouldn't be better for Vost to get it instead."
Goodall felt the tension in the cargo hold. They were talking treason. Treason of the worst kind. They had signed on with Vost because he was a leader who would get them the best deal. Now they were talking about changing sides. Was it for the better deal? Or was it because some honor in each of them had not been satisfied? Goodall looked directly into the eyes of her tech. Do you want to warn Takuda?
"Do you mean me or us?"
I guess I mean us.
"Then yes, I think we should warn him."
Who does it?
"You've got to stay with your mech," Johnson said after a moment. "I'm the one who can get away without creating too much suspicion. Let me do it."
20. Or maybe not 20, because I'm supposed to stop that and then start the new recording. Let's see what Frosty Tools has had to say today so far, shall we?
In the dimly lit alley of Sir Arminius's chat, a figure emerges from the shadows, Seribot, making their entrance with a digital flourish. The streets buzz with anticipation as this sentinel of order steps onto the scene. The plot thickens in just chatting as we delve into the far country of Battletech lore. Stay tuned, folks. It's going to be a wild ride. Meanwhile, let's catch up on chat. The chat's been quieter than a stealth mech in the far country, but the vibes are still as chill as a winter night on Solaris 7. Sir Arminius is deep into the Battletech lore, and we're all here for the mechs and the intrigue. Let's rev up those engines and get some chatter going, folks. What are your favorite Battletech moments?
Look at Siri, or look at Frosty Tools trying to get the conversation started in chat. Go Frosty Tools. All right, here we go. 20. The dripping darkness added to the sense of espionage and secrecy. No wind blew across the open field where the diverse band of humans had camped, and the gentle misting rain obscured the tall trees beyond, cloaking the encampment further in an air of conspiracy. Within the darkness, vague shapes moved stealthily on missions of equal urgency and secrecy, each one avoiding, as if by choreographed movement, the presence of the others. In the darkness beyond the circle of grass marking the camp zone, the forest teemed with a secret movement of its own, the Tatate creeping closer and closer to the human zone. Had the desk guards been alert in their security positions on the perimeter, they would have sensed the advance of the Tatate. They were busy with other matters. The moment darkness had fallen, changing the gloom of daylight fading under low clouds to a Stygian blackness, the desk sections had begun to move. They did not move fast, and they did not move far, but began to gradually slip away from their established positions to rally around the command bunker. Takuda had left his position as soon as it was full dark. He was gone before the glowing shape of the LAM pilot, seen through the IR scanner, scrambled up the side of the LAM and took his place in the cockpit. George Bousteau, the desk headquarters clerk, watched the glow of the internal power supply begin to flow into the mech's control, propulsion, and weapon systems. He reported the activity to Takuda, who was shielded from the prying eyes of the LAM's IR sensors. Not only was his form masked by the rising bulk of the bunker, but like every other member of the desk team, he was wearing an IR suppression suit. The area where the human survivors was camped was several hundred meters wide by 6 kilometers long. The dropship and the Teledyne's lifeboat had grounded at one end, just short of the trees that barred further passage. The security arrangements they'd established put the desk headquarters some 500 meters behind the dropship hulk, with the 2 light sections spread out in a wide V behind it. The weapons section had been separated from the others, held near the headquarters as a reserve force. Security for the dropship had been provided by the mercenaries and the ship crews. Takuda had not deemed it the best possible arrangement, but the plan had suited the various personalities involved. Now the arrangement suddenly became an asset. The topography of the area permitted anyone on the dropship to see only the desk command bunker. Even the LAM, positioned near the forward edge of the dropship's port wing, could see only the desk headquarters and the position of the western section. But it could not see both with the same accuracy. The result was that Brian Seagroves, sitting tense in the cockpit of his Phoenix Hawk, had a clear IR signature from the command position, but only a faint blue blur from the section area. He could see the heat signature from the entrance of the headquarters, but Yura had made sure that the bunker's stove was going full bore. The heat that radiated from the mouth of the bunker virtually blocked out any faint IR noise from the surrounding area. Even Bousteau, lying on top of the bunker itself, was invisible, and anyone moving along the eastern side of the ridge that marked the center of the position would be equally hidden. Takuda was in a quandary about the operation. If this had been a standard desk mission, winning would have meant the elimination of every mercenary around the mechs. It would leave no survivors. But this was not standard. Takuda had no desire to kill all the mercenaries. They had done nothing to earn such retribution. There had only been the report that Vost was planning to break the mechs out of the hull and make a run for the enclaves. They'd also been warned that the LAM was to destroy the command bunker, but that seemed logical. Takuda would have done the same if given the opportunity, but he had no wish to destroy the mechs and their pilots. Takuda knew only too well that he would need them in his dealings with the enclaves. Thus he had ordered his people to use non-deadly force. If deadly force became necessary, only Takuda would give the order. The attacking force consisted of the 2 light teams commanded by Arsenault and Knight. Sine stayed at the CP with the heavy section. From there, she would be able to direct the SRM, loaded with Inferno missiles, at any heavy target that appeared, She also had Miranda and his heavy rifle available to eliminate individual targets. The heavy team was the only one armed with deadly weapons. The other DEST members were carrying trank guns. Approaching the starboard side of the dropship, the DEST team fanned out. Takuda and the headquarters section were in the center, with Knight and his section to the right, Arsenault and his to the left. They crept through the grass, scanning the target with their IR sensor goggles. One glowing life form stood out clearly against the black of night. It was Reston Bannon, master and commander of the late jumpship Teledyne, standing guard. He was seated on top of the dropship, his legs dangling into the gaping wound that had been cut in the ship's side to release the lamb. His guard position was most awkward for the assaulting DEST. Takuda signaled Knight to take Bannon out of the equation. Holland moved silently to scale the nose of the dropship. The rest of the DEST team watched her creep over the battered ogive and along the top of the hull. Perhaps it was some water on the hull, or maybe a spot of lubricant left by one of the mercenaries. The DEST team watched her creep over the battered top of the hull. Spot of lubricant left by one of the her felt-soled shoes suddenly made a noise. Not much of one, and not one that would have been noticed during normal activity. But on this night, with no wind to mask the sounds, the slight squeak of her boots on the titanium alloy skin screeched like a banshee. Bannon twisted to face her. Before he could grasp the situation, before he could open his mouth to give the alarm, Holland reacted. In one swift gesture, she brought the trank rifle from its carry position on her back, leveled the weapon, and fired 2 quick shots. One would have been enough for the jump ship skipper. The second was just insurance. The soft thunk-thunk of the rifle echoed through the gaping cavity of the dropship's cargo bay, unheard by the workers on the deck 10 meters below. From his post on the outer skin, Reston Bannon had a momentary vision of a figure swathed in black. Then his vision clouded and he lost control of his muscles. He reached out to brace himself against the skin of the ship, but his arms had lost their ability to respond. He toppled forward into the opening. Holland reached for him to stop his fall, but she was too far away. As if in slow motion, the body of the jump ship's skipper dropped onto the inner cargo deck of the ship. If the reports of the trank rifle had passed unnoticed, the crash of the falling body did not. As Bannon took his dive into the black hole of the cargo bay, Takuda signaled the rest of the DEST team forward, up and running toward the jagged rent in the side of the dropship. They carried their trank guns at the ready. The weapons were best at extremely close ranges, and Takuda knew they would have to get inside the hull of the vessel to have any chance of subduing the mercenaries. Inside the hull, the thud of the falling body was amplified as the sound rebounded from the metal interior. Vost, halfway up the right side of the Panther, froze as he reached for the next handhold. He'd seen the body dropping out of the corner of his eye. The form of Reston Bannon now lay curled beside the left foot of his mech. Then he heard the pounding feet of the charging DEST team. The game was up, and he knew it.
"We're out of here!"
he shouted as he scrambled toward the Panther's cockpit. Below him, the dark interior bloomed with light. The Omoso Panda was standing with his back to the jagged opening in the hull. He sensed, rather than saw, the DEST team charge across the open ground and under the wing of the dropship. He had his stern-snocked auto pistol holstered on his right hip, and he drew it as he turned to face the darkness. Behind him, the interior lighting system flared into life, bathing the area around the opening in brilliant blue clarity. Panda saw a black figure silhouetted in the glare. Without hesitation, he drew the heavy pistol, raised it to face level, and fired. The flash of the pistol erased any remaining night vision the technician might have had. The dark figure went down. Inside the cargo hold, the mech warriors were settling into the command seats of their mechs. Hands raced in well-accustomed gestures across the master switches and toggles. The cockpit recorders, sensors, and displays bloomed to life. Down below, technicians drove heavy mauls into the last of the restraining shackles. The mechs were free, but they still did not move. None of the pilots would engage their drive systems until the entire checklist was completed. Even if the pilot had just done a third-level diagnostic and maintenance check, he would follow the entire initiation sequence. There were no old, bold pilots. The desk team came pouring through the gap in the hull, their tranq rifles discarded in favor of lasers. Seeing Yura go down under the blast of a heavy pistol, Takuda knew that the mercenaries were playing for keeps. He, too, would have to up the ante. He warned his people to be careful, still hoping to avoid having a pile of dead when the attack was over. Then Arsenault and his team scrambled across the dropship's starboard wing and rolled through the opening into the brilliant light of the cargo hold. Inside the Panther, Vost's cockpit instruments glowed green. Twisting the mech's torso to the right, he searched for possible targets. With nothing but a PPC and an SRM launcher, it would be disastrous for him to fire in the confined space of the cargo hold. His weapons made the Panther a powerful mech, but at ranges of only a few meters, he'd have been better off with machine guns. He saw Pesht and his javelin begin to move away from the bulkhead where the mech had been secured. The javelin was in the same situation as the Panther. Its heavy load of SRMs did not make it a good fighting machine in a confined space. But, like the Panther, it could jump clear of the area. The Locusts, however, would have to walk out. One of the desk team was slinking around the feet of the shuffling javelin, a grapple rod for attacking the mech in his hand. Vost thought momentarily of firing his PPC at the figure, then changed his mind. That was Pesht's problem.
"Man at your feet," he warned. "Goodall, Frank, get him with your machine guns."
Outside the dropship, Seagrove saw the bloom of light and heard the warning. As he triggered the pair of medium lasers on the arms of his lamb, the command bunker erupted in a brilliant ball of white fire. "That'll take care of you, Takuda," he thought. He smiled, but the smile vanished as an infernal missile arced out of the darkness and struck the ground at the feet of the Phoenix Hawk. He felt his heart jump. Out of here, that's what Vost had said. Sounds like a good idea, thought Seagroves. I'd rather be rich than dead. The twin-allied Aviar-Tech 125 jump jets roared into life as another inferno slammed into the ground where the mech had been. "Adios, suckers," whispered Seagroves as the Phoenix Hawk lifted into the air. Inside the cargo area, the streams of machine gun bullets crisscrossed the open area. Bodies, caught in the deadly hail, ricocheted off the bulkheads in a macabre dance. Holly Goodall swung her twin heavy machine guns across the white void, searching for targets. Centered in her crosshairs, she saw the rigid shape of a desk soldier. She squeezed the triggers, taking up the slack. But then she saw that it was Takuda. Making an instant decision, she continued to traverse instead of firing. To her right, she saw Brank's Locust making a similar sweep through the cargo bay, his twin guns stopping on the same target. Without hesitation, Goodall swung her mech's torso as far to the right as it would go, taking a step forward with her left leg to complete the traverse. The cockpit of the other Locust steadied in her targeting crosshairs. She punched the firing button. Standing at the opening of the cargo bay, Vost knew there was nothing he could do here, and he'd only be cut to ribbons if he stayed. Firing the Panther's jump jets, he rose up and out of the combat. On his secondary screen, he saw his techs also making for the woods. Inside the cargo bay, the recumbent body of Reston Bannon vaporized under the searing plasma of the Panther's jump jets. Then the mech was clear of the dropship. Boast hit the ground running, the javelin right behind him. It had taken Pesht one step to center himself in the same opening. Then he had fired the smaller Rawlings jets and lifted out after his commander. The two mechs made contact in the darkness outside. For a moment they contemplated going back to free the locusts, but their calls brought no response. The lights in the cargo hold blinked out. With the Lamb already gaining altitude, Vost called Pesht to his side, and the two mechs began lumbering westward toward the enclaves.
Ah, there you go. There's our first fight, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. Oh, yeah.
But in a moment, we'll start into Chapter 21. Take a moment to rest my voice. All right. Here we go. 21. Parker DeVood crept through the sudden stillness. He had sheltered in the access crawlway during the combat that had unexpectedly engulfed his dropship. Not that it was much of a dropship anymore, he thought, or that it was even his anymore. He wasn't quite sure why he had been in the crawlway between the flight deck and the main cargo area, but something had driven him there early in the evening. Perhaps he thought it was his unwillingness to participate in the Vost prank scheme to eliminate Takuda and the other Dest members. The whole thing had seemed like a good idea when they'd first talked it out, but the more he thought about it, the less he wanted any part of it. He didn't care, one way or the other, who was to be the leader of their little society, but he couldn't accept violence as the means of choosing that person. Vost's idea of putting it to a vote was a good one, though DeVood wasn't quite sure whom he'd vote for if it came to that. Vost had a lot of good ideas, but Takuda seemed an honorable man. Now DeVood lay in the access passage listening for the sounds that would tell him what was going on. He'd heard the roar of the jump jets when the mechs had fired them in the cargo hold. The shock had been enough to make the derelict hulk of the dropship tremble from top to bottom. Then had come a series of explosions from outside as well. Now there was silence. He strained to hear any sound of movement. No one came. He continued to crawl toward the emergency lighting panel access port that hung at the end of the passage. With his hand resting on the switches, DeVood paused for a moment, wondering if it was a good idea to illuminate the scene. He didn't know the situation, and light might just exacerbate an already potential disaster. He held his breath and threw the switches. Soft blue-green emergency lights flooded from the backup illumination panels. Carefully raising his head, DeVood scanned the cargo hold, but the lingering skeins of gossamer smoke gently eddying in the air made it hard to see much. That the cargo hold was a jumble of twisted frames and broken spars confused him at first. Smoking bales of unidentifiable debris were scattered across the deck and piled around the two mechs that still stood forlornly against the rear bulkhead. DeVood stared at the mechs, trying to figure out what made them suddenly look different when they'd always looked identical to him. Perhaps, he thought, it It was only because he was viewing them from the new angle. Then something moving on the deck drew his attention. He studied the area, trying to catch it again. Then he saw it. It was a man crawling ever so slowly across the metal plating. He was leaving a distinct trail of something dark and light behind him. Davood felt his stomach rise in his mouth, the bitter taste of his own gorge pressing against his teeth. The black trail was blood. Light stuff was the man's entrails. Another man bent over the crawling figure. Davood saw that he, like the wounded man, was dressed from head to foot in black. Then he noticed other black-draped figures picking their way through the rubble. The desk team held the cargo area. Takuda straightened up from his position over Roland Dupe. There wasn't much he could do for him, even with the advanced medical systems they had with them. Dupe had been climbing one of the mechs, using a grapple rod to reach a delicate arm joint or perhaps a jet propulsion unit that gave the mech its jump capability. But the mech had made its move before the desk commando could plant his explosive charges. It had been a brave but foolhardy move on the part of Dupe, yet just the sort of action the man would try. All Takuda could do now was to make him as comfortable as possible. He searched for the wounded man's personal medikit, which was normally strapped to the calf of a desk member's inside right leg. But Takuda found no right leg, at least nothing where the medkit should have been. He would have searched the other leg, but it too was gone below the knee. Roland Dupe squirmed on toward the opening in the hull of the dropship, but Takuda reached down and restrained him.
It's all right, Dupe. You're safe here.
Dupe rolled over onto his back and stared blankly at his commander. Takuda could see the effort as he tried to focus. The man's eyes cleared and he looked up into those of Takuda kneeling beside him. He reached up and grasped the collar of the black battlesuit.
I'm done,
he gasped.
Isn't that the way it always is for me? I was just doing my job, and the others didn't help. I'm always the one who gets it in the shorts.
Griping to the last, thought Takuda. Yes, he mused, Roland Dupe was done. There was nothing anyone here could do for him.
You did well, he said. No one could have done better.
Dupe shuddered as a wave of pain swept over him. Takuda could see the wounds were not restrained and restricted to his legs alone. The man had been gutted like a perch, split from crotch to chin. His whole interior was pouring from what was left of his battlesuit. The dying man put both hands on the collar of his commander.
Finish me,
he gasped.
Finish me.
He fell back against the metallic plating of the deck. Takuda rose and stared, unseen, at the fallen soldier. There was nothing he could do to help him, nothing he could do to ease the pain. He had syringes of anesthesia in his own medikit, but there was not enough painkiller in all of Dest to alleviate what Dupe was feeling. The wretched, twisted face looked up at him, the eyes silent and imploring. Without seeing, without even being fully aware of what he was doing, Takuda drew the needier pistol from the holster at the small of his back. Almost in slow motion, he brought the weapon around and pointed it into the face of the wounded man. He could not fire. Dupe was lying on the plates, his back arched in pain, his eyes closed. Then the eyes of the wounded man popped open and he saw his fate above him. For an instant, he stared at the pistol, knew what was about to happen. A look of fear spread over the grimace of pain. Then he relaxed and looked into the face of his commander. Dupe smiled and nodded. Takuda squeezed the trigger, firing the entire clip. Takuda stood for a moment at the side of the dead man. Around him was the chaos of a battle won, or at least a battle not lost. Two of the mechs had escaped, but the two light locusts were still in the cargo hold. His team had been hit hard, though. With Dupe now dead at his feet, that was 3 Dest members gone. Saitan Yura had died at the mouth of the cargo hold, taking a shot from a heavy slug pistol through the face. And Oite Inaduma had made one heroic charge too many with his anti-tank weapon. While rising, the lamb had hit the man with a random shot as he climbed out of the melee. And now Dupe was gone too. The wounded, including Takuda himself, would have to be attended to. The weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders, he holstered the pistol and moved away. The Dest team, the surviving mercenary techs, and the 2 remaining crew members from the ships spent a night filled with tension, fear, and small alarms. They all expected the mercenary mechs to return to finish the job. There were 2 battle mechs still within the cargo hold, as well as the few remaining technicians who had failed or chosen not to flee when the others had made their break for freedom. With the heavy weapons section reduced, the defense against a mech attack would have been desperate at best. But the mechs never came. There was also the hovering presence of the Tatate, who the Dest members now had the time to discover lingering in the fringes of the heavy woods. There was no way of telling if they were hostile, friendly, or just observers, only that they were there. Takuda decided to keep a watch on them, but to do nothing that would precipitate any kind of action. The Tatate were still there when the first faint rays of the morning sun broke over the tops of the eastern trees. It promised to be a fine day, with only a few puffy clouds from the front that had moved through the area. In full daylight, the situation was further revealed. Takuda still had 9 Dest members, but those 3 were wounded: Dana Lost, Fallen Horg, and himself. Mark Jacobs and Parker DeVoot of the ship's crew were still around, but Takuda didn't know how valuable they would be. Of the mercenaries, only Holly Goodall was uninjured. Now there, thought Takuda, was an enigma. Goodall had warned them of the impending combat, and she had, by the evidence, taken care of one of the mech pilots. The shattered cockpit of the Locust bore mute testimony to that, but he was not sure of her status now. 2 technicians had also remained behind, but both might have escaped with the others had they not been wounded. Sagiri Johnson, the chief tech, and, like Goodall, one of those who had passed the warning, had been injured by the jump jet blast of one of the departing mechs. Underos Yapudi carried a wound from the laser rifle in his right arm. Although how he had come by it was a mystery, he might have been hit by a random burst from either the Dest team or the fleeing mercenaries, although Takuda had a tendency to discount random shots by his people. Dest members did not take random shots. The major task before him now was to remove the 2 locusts from the dropship. If the mercenaries decided to come back and finish the job, the Dest team would need their own mechs. The locusts were not as powerful as either the Panther or the Lamb, but they could hold their own against the Javelin. Working together, they could also provide a good fight for the Panther. The lasers had some range, and the speed enjoyed by the light mechs could keep them relatively safe until it came to a showdown. But first, Takuda would have to get them out of the ship. Goodall proposed that someone among the survivors be trained to operate the Locust. Though all the Dest members were qualified as mech pilots, putting one of them into the cockpit would reduce the already strained fabric of the team. It would have to be someone else. Mark Jacobs became the volunteer. Takuda wasn't quite sure how that happened, but suddenly the little chief engineer was crawling into the Locust's cockpit. Another enigma, thought Takuda. The Teledyne's engineer had been more like a non-person to Takuda thus far. Jacobs had been polite and competent enough aboard the Teledyne, but had simply faded into the background since the crash. Now he was volunteering to pilot a mech. Takuda had no way of knowing that Jacob's background included more than jump ship engineering. In his youth, the man had been trained as a mech pilot by his father, but Jacob's dream of becoming a mech warrior died when his father's lance was destroyed in a long-forgotten battle. The sudden resurgence of the long-buried dream had propelled him, almost involuntarily, into the cockpit of the Locust. He didn't even seem to mind that they had to scrape the remains of Colin's Brank off the inside of the cockpit and out of the neurohelmet. By the end of the day, the debris had been cleared from the legs of the Locust, and they were clear to move to the opening in the hull. Jacobs was all ready to pilot the Locust out of the cargo hold, but Takuda would not allow it. Even a desk member without a neurohelmet would be a better pilot than Jacobs, he decided. The engineer gave up his position to Sean Arsenault with a disgruntled look, but Takuda permitted him to ride inside the shattered ogive for the experience. Molly Goodall went first in her Locust, talking through the process out loud. She moved slowly, carefully planting the feet of the Locust on the deck of the dropship. Goodall paused at the mouth of the gaping rent in the skin of the ship. The opening was big enough for an experienced pilot to maneuver without difficulty, but Arsenault was not an experienced pilot. Goodall talked herself through the opening, planning to talk Sean through his in turn. That way he would have heard the instructions twice. Goodall stepped through just as the last rays of the setting sun struck the top of the dropship. She turned to face the opening as she began the instructions. With her face toward the dropship and her back to the woods, he didn't see the Tatate emerging from the forest. So, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So you have barely enough of an opening for an experienced Locust pilot to get through. You have a Locust pilot. Pilot the first one out, get out of your mech, walk to the other one, get in the other mech, and pilot that one out. Why would you have very inexperienced people doing that very difficult maneuver when you don't have to? You've got the time. Is it just me? Do I just not understand?
Newscast update. The chat room has just welcomed a new arrival. Siribon has entered the scene, ready to stir up some digital dust. Stay tuned for more updates as Sir Arminius dives into the epic tales of Far Country. Hashtag BotWatch, hashtag ChatHype.
All right, we got 3 chapters left. Hey, Sub-Average Joe. So, experience with getting it out, sure. But when are you ever going to do that maneuver again? And why would you risk the mech by not having an experienced pilot take it out? And then once you're out into the open, nice plains, now you can just go ahead and walk along, and you can do all your training, and you can do all your other things. There's no reason at that point not to let them play. Maybe not coming out of the dropship through a little itty-bitty hole that's just wider than the Locust. But, who am I? All right, let's jump into the next chapter, shall we? 22. The Tatate had been in the forest for nearly a full 24 hours. They'd arrived just after dusk the previous night, and had been watching the humans ever since. Observing the movement within the camp, they had immediately recognized it as dangerous. Hadn't enough of the tribe already seen enough humans in their killing frenzy? They understood the desk team's stealthy movements as a precursor to violence. They knew that when humans fought, any Tatate who got in the way would die, quickly and without remorse. Better, they decided, to observe and not become involved. The double explosions of the jump-capable mechs had scared them to the point of incoherence. So had the Lamb's takeoff. Dakota had seen the Phoenix Hawk when it had left the dropship the first time, but none of the others were prepared for the violence of the event. Especially at night, the sight of a mech rising from the ground was an awesome experience. When the jumping mechs had come crashing back to the ground, the Tatate became so terrified that some of them had scattered wildly and frantically trying to get away. Some had died as a result, for the mech pilots had not cared where they placed the giant feet of their machines in their haste to escape the dropship area. It had been a night of terror, and the event would forever be remembered as such in the oral history of the tribe. The Tatate had gathered up their dead and injured while continuing to watch the humans. The humans had not come after them as they had feared, but instead had moved closer and closer to the thing that fell from the sky with fire. Perhaps, said some of the Tatate, the thing was preparing to leave. Dakota said nothing to disabuse him of that hope. The humans would remain, he knew, and the Tatate would have to deal with them. And so the day had passed. Some of the humans stood around the hull of the thing that fell from the sky with fire, while others went in and out of its belly. The Tatate waited for something of importance to happen, but the humans only stood around and waited as well. In the falling light that signaled an end to another day, the Tatate saw the thing that was going to happen. It wasn't that the thing was going to fly, for the actions of the humans showed no sign of departure. They stood now in a half circle around the opening in the hull and stared into its dark interior. There was excitement. They began to cheer. Andy Holland was the first to see the aliens break the wood line. Goodall's locust had just cleared the entrance and had turned to talk Arsenault through the opening. Holland was watching the process with some interest when she heard a noise in the woods behind them. Though forest sounds had become almost background input for her, heard and qualified but not consciously registered, this was something different. As she turned to look, she saw the Tatate coming out of the woods. They didn't emerge. They boiled. They were crowded together in a tight pack. Those in front jostled forward by those in the rear. The front ones, reluctant to approach and yet forced forward, drifted to the outside of the gaggle, which eventually put others in the lead. Those who had been pushing the front members suddenly found themselves in the front ranks. Then they began to balk and resist the thrust from the rear. Those who had been in front, reluctant to approach, found themselves suddenly emboldened by their relative security. They pressed forward against the backs of the reluctant leaders. Holland sounded the alarm in her lip mic and then dropped to one knee. She didn't want to shoot these little creatures, but if pressed, she would have to. She raised the rifle to her shoulder and aimed at the center of the boiling crowd of fur. The crosshairs of the laser sight steadied on the figure of Dakota. She took up the slack in the trigger. The Tatate was moving toward her in a strange, crouched walk. Holland took a breath and then let half of it out, just as she had been trained to do on the rifle range. Then she paused. Dakota was not behaving aggressively. His bobbing gait resembled that of a man who couldn't decide whether to advance on his feet or his knees. Holland let the sight drift over the others. All were doing the same thing, advancing with their bodies held low between their legs. She relaxed her finger and let her breath out with a hiss. The massive Tatate advanced more and more slowly, spreading out to surround the shattered dropship. The desk team stood with their backs to the hulk, their weapons cradled at the waist, safeties off, but waiting. Takuda emerged from the center of the line to meet Dakota, who now crept forward from the center of mass. With him were two other Tatate whom Takuda had never seen. The three Tatate advanced, their eyes fixed on the locust towering over them. They jabbered to each other and to Dakota, who responded in turn. Takuda did not understand the words, but the tone of Dakota's voice made them sound soothing. The Tatate turned back to Takuda. We are amazed, he said, staring up at the locust. Holland had turned the mech to face the crowd of Tatate. You may be the ones who will be changing everything. You are the ones. Dakota stepped forward and drew the other two forward. These are Totito and Dokepi, the leaders of our tribe. They are here to see the other humans, the ones I have spoken of. Now they find that you are quite different. You are what we have been waiting for since the others arrived so long ago. Now everything will be better. It will be as it was before they came. Takuta was confused. The Tatate were not hostile, but this was more than just awe at the size of the mechs. The Locust was not a particularly impressive mech, certainly not like either the Panther or the Phoenix Hawk, yet it was the one that had brought the Tatate from the protection of the forest. Seeing the aliens and the mech together, Takuta was suddenly struck by the similarity to the two-legged bird-like creatures of the woods. The Locust was a Tatate grown to enormity and sheathed in metal. Dakota explained the situation as best he could. In the beginning, he said, the Tatate had lived in the woods. They did not have a sense of what was good or bad, no sense of the malevolent. Things were just as they were. There were natural events that swept down upon the tribe. Wildfire, great winds, storms of ice, but they were not thought of as punishment. Then came those who fell from the sky with fire. They brought harm to the Tatate that could not be reconciled with the nature of things. The humans had taught the Tatate that there were such a thing as an angry super being. The Tatate had believed this and assumed that the humans represented that. Since then, the Tatate had come to believe the legends taught by the humans, that there was an evil in their past and that there was a future. That was another concept that the Tatate had never imagined. They had always been taught that as it was, so it had always been. As it was, so always it would be. The humans had proved that different, but with the establishment of a past and a future, as taught by the humans, there had to be a hope in the future that things would get better. That had become the new belief of the Tatate. What that future would be, no one had ever fully explained. Perhaps, said Dakota, it required more generations than those that had passed in the 500 years since the arrival of those who came with fire. Now, according to Dokepe, the shaman of the tribe, that time had come. The shape and size of the monsters that accompanied the new ones who came from the sky with fire showed that they had arrived to aid the Tatate and show them the future. Dokepe said that these humans were the ones to whom the Tatate could turn in hope of a better life. The Tatate would serve the humans who served the great symbols of their existence. Dakota's recitation finished, Takuta stood in silence. He had never faced the dilemma of being considered or treated like a deity. Commanders were sometimes allowed to make mistakes, but he doubted a deity enjoyed that luxury. When first they had crashed on this unknown world, he had struggled with the sudden prospect of wielding absolute command. But now he was confronted with the prospect of even more power. Not only he, but all the humans who were with him. Takuta was silently thankful that Boast was not here to hear this. Takuta protested. Using Dakota as his translator, Takuta registered his protest. He tried to explain that he and his group of humans were no better or worse than the others. That falling from the sky was an accident, that the mechs were just machines that had no special symbolism to anyone or anything. But it was no use. No, said Dakota. Totito and Dokepe were convinced that the opposite was true. There was no way that he and Takuta would be able to change that belief. The Tatate believed that the locusts with Takuda were the way of the future. The Tatate were here to serve the mechs and the humans they brought with them. The word of the humans would be absolute. If Takuda told them to go away, that is what they would do. But the status of the humans and their monoliths would remain unchanged.
Don't you understand that we are just like the others? Don't you understand that we humans who can die?
Asked Takuda.
I can show you the bodies of those who have fallen. I can show you the ones who have been injured.
That, said Dakota, only I am able to understand. Others will not believe. To them you will be supreme, even if all of you die. As long as the great beings remain, you will be special to them.
I am a human, snapped Takuda. No better or worse than any other human. Believe that.
I do, but I cannot change what's done. You human, but are special. You special to me in certain ways, and you special to them in other ways. So it is, and nothing you can do, not even killing us, will change that. Takuda was defeated. He and his motley troop of humans had become, the leaders of the Tatate. Perhaps, he thought, that would change in time, but for now he could do nothing about it. The problem of absolute power had returned, with a vengeance. It was his fate, he decided, to be a leader, if not among men, then among the aliens who saw him as a god. Oh no, not a god.
It's just a little flesh wound on the locust. Scraping my paint off as we drop from the dropship. Them French fried potatoes.
All right. Shall we jump into Chapter 23? We got Chapter 23 and Chapter 24 to finish up tonight. And then next week we'll start Chapter 25. But here we go. Let's start the next one. 23. The warning sirens in the hold of the dropship began to howl. Their screaming ululation struck into the marrow of those gathered near the shattered hull and even into the closed cockpits of the battle mechs. Hands pressed against his ears, Parker DeVood stepped through the access port into the hold and staggered to the rent in the side. He was yelling something, but the screech of the sirens drowned out the words. When the sirens stopped abruptly, DeVood's voice was suddenly loud in the stillness. "Really close! The mechs are really close! The sensors picked them up!" While the others had been involved in unraveling the philosophical conundrum of the status of the humans, the Locust and the Tatate, DeVood had been on the flight deck of the dropship. He had engaged what was left of the sensors after the crash, and begun to search the distance. When the telltale blips of heat had appeared on the IR screen, he tried to communicate with the desk team and the mechs, but the sending unit would not accept power. The siren had been his last resort. It did have a marvelous way of attracting attention.
"How close?"
asked Takuda, his mind still assaulted by the sound. "Can't get an accurate fix," replied DeVood, "but they're close enough for me to get a solid impression." "We're dead meat in the open like this," said Goodall from her perch on the shoulders of the Locust. She climbed out of the cockpit during the discussion. If the Locust's appearance had powerfully affected the Tatate, the appearance of a human from the side of the head of the alien deity had been a real shocker. Arsenault and Jacobs had also evacuated their cockpit. Takuda looked around at the bare ground. Their defensive position, strong in its ability to deliver long-range fire against any attack from the woods, was suddenly vulnerable. Now the dropship sat like a center ring on a dartboard, an absolute magnet for any attack. Goodall was right. Standing in the open against 3 mechs would only get everyone killed, including the Tatate. And the Tatate were now a consideration in any plans. Takuda would have liked to tell everyone to die in place, but the Tatate would do just that, and the desk commander felt the extra weight of responsibility for the furry, helpless beings. This being a god was more than just a formal tea that led to a philosophical discussion. This was the real thing. Along with absolute power came absolute responsibility. Takuda was a qualified mech pilot, but he hated the iron monsters. They gave you plenty of weapons and armor, but you also sacrificed individual flexibility. Not only that, you also became a bullet attractor for the other side. He much preferred the vulnerability of his own body to the loss of control that armor gave. That was why he decided to remain a lowly foot soldier, turning down the chance to command a mech lance when the post had been offered many years before. He looked up at Goodall.
We'll have to leave the mechs behind. They're too much of a liability. We can evade in the woods on foot.
Goodall glanced around the clearing. Abandoning mechs was not something she was willing to do unless the situation was really desperate, and she didn't have that feeling just yet. Her mech was clear of the dropship, and she mentally calculated the time required to get the second locust free. There was a chance, but someone would have to pilot the other mech. "Parker," she said, turning to the dropship commander, "do you still have power for the ship's weapons targeting array?" Dawood thought for a moment before answering. "I have power, but that won't help. You and Vost both knew the weapons themselves are out of commission." "Vost won't know whether we've repaired the weapons or not. Just initiate the sequence. Vost will see the emission, and it may make him think twice. That will slow him down. Anything to make him stop and wonder." She looked down at Takuda. "I think we can save the mechs. If someone can pilot the other one, I think we can at least get free. If we get into the woods, we may have a chance."
"That's no good," said Takuda with a shrug. "I can't let Arsenal pilot the Locust. He's too valuable as a section leader. Can't afford to have a good man trapped in something he can't fight."
"I can do it." It was Jacobs.
"At least I can try."
He paused as his eyes met those of Takuda.
"I can pilot a mech. I've been trained. I can do it. It wasn't on one of these, but I understand how they work. I can do it. Really, I can."
Takuda thought for a moment. Jacobs was a null as far as he was concerned. Neither an asset nor a liability in the team's survival equation. If he were lost, the sum would not change. It was worth the gamble.
"All right, Jacobs," he said. "If you think you can get the mech 3, try it. But remember," he said, looking straight at Goodall, "we're not going to sacrifice ourselves for the mechs. Understand that."
"Roger last," said the pilot. Mechs would be on their own. If they were to become part of the team, they would have to survive on their own merits. Goodall was sure that she could do it, but she wasn't so sure that Jacobs and the other Locusts would do as well. All they could do was try. Mech pilots were individualistic in the extreme, and mercenary mech pilots a step even beyond that. But Goodall felt the emotional draw to any other mech. She would do her best to keep Jacobs alive. It was a challenge she was willing to accept. "We'll be right behind you, sir." The old habit of command slipped into place. Takuda was the boss now, and she'd follow his orders. Jacobs was already in the command seat of the Locust, lifting one giant metal leg tentatively to clear the edge of the shattered hull. Arsenault was on the ground, helping Lost with his gear. The wounded man would need assistance if he were to clear the area before the heavy weapons began to shoot. Despite the heavy sedation they'd given him, he was whimpering from the pain. Lost, like the other wounded members of the group, would be a serious liability when the running started. He would be better as a shooter, but that would mean having to leave him behind if they had to make a run for it. The foot of the locust came down on the ground, and Jacobs shifted the mech's weight to the outside leg. Gingerly, he lifted the other one and began to extract it. There was no way he could brace himself, for the locust had no arms. "Brace yourself with the last bar," came the suggestion through the earpiece of his communicator. Goodall was giving as much help as she could. "Just hold it against the side of the ship. Don't push too hard or you'll bend the activator tube. Get the crystals out of alignment and it'll be useless. Just enough to steady yourself. Gently now." Jacobs rotated the locust torso until the laser came in contact with the ship. That felt more stable, and he moved the inner leg again. He watched as the foot came almost clear of the side, but he couldn't get it quite over the lip. "Stop!" came Goodall's voice over the comm line. "Stop the leg." He obeyed. "Now activate the foot to swing it clear. Lock the foot in its full back position. Remember to unlock it when you're clear. You don't want to put it down while frozen." Jacobs paused to absorb the instructions. He was getting too much information too soon. He'd have to be careful. Outside the hull of the dropship, the desk team was making final plans for evacuation. The real problem was the heavy equipment. With the heavy weapons section reduced to only 2 members, they had more than enough to carry. They'd broken up the loads among the unwounded desk members, but that only gave them 4 more bearers. There was just too much. They'd have to leave something behind. "Let us help you," said Dakota. The Tatate was still there, not a single one having made a move to flee. They stood there shuffling back and forth, watching the humans. Dakota had completely forgotten about them, assuming that they would already have headed for the woods. Now they intruded on his already busy brain. "We are small, but there are many of us," continued Dakota. "Each one of us can carry something." Dakota wanted to ask many questions. Where will you take it? How much can each of you carry? Will it all get to the right place at the right time? Will you damage it when you carry it? Too many questions, too little time. "Do it," he said. Dakota turned to the other 2 who were standing with him. He rattled off a string of musical gibberish. There was a brief response from the others, followed by another stream of the same sort of stuff. The little Tatate, the one who had been identified as Totito, turned to the tribe, gave a short command, and then the gaggle of Tatate exploded into action. They swept around Dakota like a wave of fur and feathers and beaks and legs. Before he could give an order, before he could even think about giving an order, the Tatate were into the pile of equipment. As if by magic, the stores vanished, carried toward the woods by an army of ants. There was nothing left for the desk team to shoulder. Dakota stood quiet amid the commotion, his eyes following the activity with benign indifference. When quiet reigned once more, he was left with 2 of his brethren, who stood bobbing and silent behind them. "These will ride with your machines. They will show them where to go. There are holes in the hills that can hide them if necessary. This one is Potate, and this one is Keotate." He turned to issue short commands to the 2 Tatate, who still bobbed and nodded. Without hesitation, each chose a locust and scrambled up the leg to settle alongside the earpiece formed by the heavy machine gun mount. It was time to go. In the distance, the panther was visible over the trees, suddenly respectful of the dropship's fire control system. Overhead, the Lamb orbited just out of PPC range, waiting for an opening to develop. Takuda knew that sooner or later Vost and Seagroves would guess the fire control system was a hoax, and then they would move in for the kill. The last of the Foot Mobile desk members were nearing the woods, the wounded supported by Tatate. Takuda signaled the Locusts to begin their withdrawal. Jacobs went first, his mech moving slowly as he mastered the controls. The mech swayed wildly as he misjudged the terrain, and Takuda could see the Tatate guide holding on with all 4 appendages while it chattered instructions at the confused pilot. The mech steadied and continued to move. Then a burst of PPC fire from the Panther snapped overhead. Either Jacobs didn't notice or was unable to do anything about it. He continued on his way toward the trees at the foot of the gently sloping hill. Goodall waited until he was almost clear. Then she too began her retreat. She backed away, watching the movements of the Panther on her sensor screen while keeping track of the Lamb with her eyes. She didn't worry about the Panther. Her Locust could move fast enough that the mech wouldn't be a real danger until it closed to short range. The Lamb was another problem entirely. With its speed, it could circle behind her and make a pass from the rear. Its triple lasers could rip the Locust apart with a few well-aimed shots. Even lucky hits would be enough to slow her down. As the Lamb streaked away to begin the attack run, she craned her head to keep it in view. As it turned to make the attack, Goodall sprinted toward the woods. By moving perpendicular to the line of the attack, she hoped to give Seagroves the most difficult movement target possible. The Panther PPC fired again, this time ripping into the shattered hull of the dropship, which vibrated under the pounding. Goodall let the Locust drop below the line of the hull, using it as shielding. PPC fired again, creating a fountain of incandescent sparks as the particles burned through the armor. A fire flashed into life in the abandoned cargo hold. Looking back, Goodall saw that the Lamb was making its attack, but she was not the target. Seagroves had either sensed or guessed that the other mech was not under full control. He had changed his point of aim from the Locust in the open to the one partially hidden by the trees. Goodall sprinted down the hill to reach a range where she could defend the vulnerable Jacobs and his mech. The Tatate guide hung on, its body pounding against the armor of the hull. The Lamb screamed in for the attack. All right, we have one more chapter to complete this evening. And then we'll talk about the next couple of days. Here we go. Let's jump in to the final chapter of the evening. Newscast update from Sir Arminius' chat room. Sub-average Joe VR is embracing the art of imperfection with a casual take on home improvement. A little paint mishap? No biggie. The chat vibe is chill as we navigate the colorful side of life. Stay tuned for more creative adventures. Well, it missed on that one. But how would it know? We're talking, and it only gets one side of the conversation. Frosty tools. All right, here we go. 24. Goodall crashed into the woods, her instinct and training keeping the Locust upright. The terrain analysis system flashed red, but she knew by the feel of the ground that she was all right. Branches whipped against the mech's torso and legs. Vines clutched at its feet. She kept going, breasting the forest out of the way in an attempt to reach Jacobs. The Tatate pounded its beak against the ogive of the cockpit window, desperately trying to get her attention. She ignored him. That was a mistake. Just as her deep terrain analyzer showed angry red across its entire spectrum, a ravine suddenly opened beneath her feet. She tried to draw the mech's leg back, but the forward momentum was too great. The locust toppled forward into the cut in the ground, the force of the fall burying the laser. Even secured by the restraining harness of the command seat, the fall was enough to create a violent shaking. Above the fallen mech, the forest branches closed to hide the attack on the other mech. Jacobs was concentrating on keeping his locust upright and under control. The Tatate guide was equally active, gibbering in a non-stop flow of advice or condemnation. Jacobs couldn't tell the difference. The little alien had tapped the cockpit window so much that the rattle of its beak now seemed like no more than background noise, which he was tempted to disregard completely. The shattered main screen of the cockpit had not yet been repaired or replaced, and vision through the front was difficult. He leaned forward in the harness to peer through the hole that the laser and machine guns had blasted through the armored glass. With one eye, he glared out at the green terrain that closed in all but the locust's upper hull. The laser blast from the Lamb came as a complete surprise, the foliage around him suddenly flashing into a cloud of steam as the column of aligned light vaporized leaves and branches. A warning light flashed angrily on the control panel, but Jacobs ignored it. It wasn't that he was either foolhardy or brave, he simply had no idea what it really meant. The Tatate gripping the hull had a better idea. The little alien had seen the metal skin on the side of the vehicle glow red and then bubble away in a fiery foam. He didn't know whether that was supposed to happen, but the sight filled him with a sense of foreboding for the safety of his charge. The Tatate beat on the side of the mech to get the pilot's attention. In the ravine, Goodall staggered to her feet in surroundings that had changed completely. Where a moment before the body of her locust had been cruising through the forest above the tops of the trees, now she found the locust was not tall enough to see above the foliage. The sensor still recorded the presence of the Lamb as it made its turn at the end of the attack run, but she couldn't get a visual fix. Around her, the forest was green gold with the light dappling through from above. She steadied the locust and began to look for a place to climb out of the pit. The Tatate guide tapped on the side of the hull. This time, she looked over to see what it wanted. The Tatate stopped its frantic hammering, pleased that the human was at last responding to its entreaties. It pointed downslope through the trees to a place that looked darker than the surrounding area. The Tatate pointed and nodded. It grew so animated that it released its arms from their hold on the hull. Goodall stared. It was the first time the alien had released its grip since they'd begun to move away from the dropship. Goodall eased the throttle forward and cautiously let the locust move forward. The ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding, but the terrain sniffer gave no warning of calamity. She moved with greater speed, confident now that she could travel without difficulty. Sensing a greater feeling of security, the Tatate grasped the hull with only one of its arms rather than with both. With the free one, it continued to point to the dark place in the forest ahead. Then Goodall saw the darkness was a cave set into the side of the ravine into which she had plunged. Jacobs, meanwhile, felt his heart pounding in his chest, the flash of the lasers having taken him completely by surprise. It was difficult enough to keep the locust under reasonable control. It just didn't seem fair that he had to get shot at as well. The constant chatter of the little Tatate on the side of his cockpit was equally unnerving. He just wanted to be left alone to deal with the problems of piloting this giant machine. He didn't regret the decision to take over the locust. The sense of power was undeniable. Why didn't they just leave him alone and let him drive? The tops of the trees to his left were suddenly shredded, and Jacobs felt a hammering on the side of the mech. He didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand that the Panther's PPC had made a rattling hit at long range. The control panel flashed more red lights, and the Tatate continued to chatter wildly. Sweat was pouring into his eyes from under the neuro helmet. Things were becoming more and more difficult. He eased the throttle forward and felt the locust suddenly sink away. He pulled back, but it was too late. The locust crashed downward through the trees, completely out of control. Jacobs hung on as he was jolted back and forth in the command seat. Branches whipped by, then came another flash of steam as the lamb's lasers burned through more of the leaves. Jacobs could smell the pungent odor of charred wood seeping into the cockpit as he continued to jolt forward. The alien's eyes appeared in the laser hole of the cockpit glass. The locust came to a jarring halt. The eye in the hole disappeared. Jacobs leaned forward against the harness to peer out at his surroundings. The surface of the trees, glaring green in the light of the rising sun, had gone. Instead, Jacob saw a dim green darkness. He had passed below the level of the vegetation into a steep valley that continued down and away before him. Twisting the mech's torso to get a sweeping view, he saw that it was all the same, just a green dankness that went on to the limit of visibility. The little Tatate tapped cautiously on the side of the cockpit. Jacobs opened the access panel and craned his head out the side. The Tatate was pointing towards something in the distance, a darker portion of the green blackness. Jacobs let the locust slide forward as directed. The green forest moved past the locust in an even flow. The little Tatate chirped away happily, tapping on the cockpit and pointing toward the goal. Jacob saw other aliens drifting through the forest. They were carrying things that looked strangely familiar. Overhead there was a burst of steam and falling leaves. The footbound Tatate scattered into the gloom. Then the mouth of a cave opened in front of him, and he understood what the Tatate wanted. Safety was just ahead. Inside the cave, he would be hidden from the lambs searching overhead. He turned gently to line the locust up with the opening, then let the mech move faster. He didn't want to get caught with Sanctuary just in reach. High above the trees, Seagroves banked the lamb for another pass at the battle mech hidden beneath the foliage. He took the craft into a high hammerhead stall and rolled it over for a power dive. His other passes had been at a shallow angle, but he knew from the target's reaction that he hadn't scored a kill. This time he would come straight down. Zero deflection, almost no intervening terrain. He let the crosshairs steady on the IR signature. The target grew bigger and bigger in his sights. The warning klaxon began to scream, telling him that he was into the maneuver envelope for his dive. He held the lamb a few seconds longer, trusting to instinct and ability to save him as they always had. The target was huge. He triggered the triple laser battery, letting the light lasers fire first to burn off the foliage so that the large laser could strike the target. There was an explosion of steam as the moisture in the foliage vaporized under the impact of the searing aligned light. Then, the large laser fired. There was a flash, and the heat signature of the locust vanished. A good kill. Deep in the cave, Jacobs felt the tension drift away from his body. There had been a terrible explosion as he entered, but he was safe. The little Tatate scrambled down and chattered happily with his mates, who looked at him with significant awe. Jacobs would have followed his guide to the floor of the cave, but he couldn't get his knees to work. They had turned to jelly. He swung his legs over the side of the hull and took several deep breaths. Perspiration had soaked through his uniform, and he could smell the stale scent of fear rising from his body. He felt a chill and shivered even in the comfortable warmth of the cave.
"Pilot Jacobs,"
came a voice from below, and when Jacobs looked over the side, he saw the desk commander looking up at him.
"Are you all right?"
Takuta's voice revealed genuine concern. Jacobs nodded. He felt warmth returning to his limbs.
Yes, sir,
He mumbled, and then again with more confidence.
Yes, sir. Had some problems, but we made it. Him and me.
He pointed toward where the little Tatate was still surrounded by his mates.
Good,
said Takuda.
That's good. Goodall is safe too. She's in another cave some distance from here, but she's all right. From what I've heard, the only one missing is Paka Davud. Evidently, he was still in the dropship when we pulled out.
Takuda shook his head.
I hope he got out all right.
It went against the instincts of the Dest members to leave anyone behind. Moments later, the missing dropship, or ex-dropship pilot, made his way into the cave, led by a Tatate. Davud was laughing and ebullient. He sat down at the feet of the silent locust and smiled at those who crowded around him. "Well," he said, "the others won't find much of value in the dropship. I vented the thruster fuel tanks before I left, and I scrammed the plant. They won't get any useful stuff from the ship. I'd love to see their faces when they start looking. The last I saw of the ship, that big mech was pouring shots in through the broken flight deck like a lunatic. I think he was really pissed." He smiled at the Dest members around him. Then his face went pale. Davud jumped to his feet and pushed through the surprised throng. "What are they doing?" he asked in a strained voice, pointing toward a cluster of humans wounded, surrounded by the group of Tatate. "Get them away from our people." Takuda stepped forward.
They're helping, Paka. They're helping. Don't worry about it.
"But they're nothing but aliens. What do they know? What can they know?"
"They can know a great deal," said Takuda. "Don't let their shape or their language fool you. They've been here a lot longer than we have. They know what works."
"But not on humans."
"Perhaps, but they'll be careful. They've led us to safety, and we have no reason not to trust them now."
Parker Davud didn't look convinced. Doubt and mistrust were clear on his face. Takuda put his hand on the pilot's shoulder, a gesture that was as strange for him as the emotion that powered it.
"We all have things to learn," he said in a soft voice. "We find ourselves in an alien situation on an alien world. We will have to adapt. It will be an interesting problem. In the past, we've always considered anything not human, and even some humans, as a lower form of life, something to be exploited or killed at our convenience. In this world, that will be different. We have to respect the lives of these beings, even if we don't completely understand them. It will be the new way."
And look, we actually got to the end of part 1, so now next time we'll start into part 2. So, yay! I know, Tuna, it's trying. We know how it is. Frosty Tools AI is only as good as it can be. All right, everyone, that is going to do it for our story time this evening. I hope you enjoyed this next set of chapters in Far Country. We've now finished part 1. Next week, we'll start into part 2. And of course, I will get all of these chapters, the 8 that we did tonight, loaded up onto my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@SirArminius. The first 16 are already up there. So looking ahead at the rest of the week, tomorrow I do have a Project New Hope advisory board meeting from 6:30 to 7:30. So I'm going to be a little bit late to my normal Pathfinder game. But as long as the rest of them are here, I will join it, and we will just join a little bit late and in progress. Thursday, of course, is Stompy Mech Night. This Friday, everyone's back home, so I will probably take Friday off, and then we'll get into the weekend and have ourselves another Stompy Mech Day somewhere. Thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer is the gift of your time. And I appreciate that you guys all gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for 2.5 hours. Whichever way. Thanks so much for having been here with me. I hope you guys will get out there and make sure that you support me on all of the additional social platforms that I have. Oop. No S. Twitch.tv/SirArmenius, YouTube.com/@SirArmenius, and TikTok.com/@SirArmenius. Have yourselves a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you guys all tomorrow. Good night, Tuna. And good night to everyone else.